It seems that something unique took place during the pandemic in how much power was unquestioningly granted to already potent institutions and organizations. And it appears to have, what do I want to say, gilded or gird a new era of unquestioning compliance, where you find, for example, with criticism of the war between Ukraine and Russia is incredibly censored now, and people just accept that you can pull up an article from 2014 in The Guardian where they were posing the very questions that would now be considered apostasy, the NATO infringement, the coup in 2014. And we've just seen this with the pandemic. Do you feel that something is being engineered on a massive scale, or do you just feel that the exponential growth of these tools happens to be in the hands of the current regime, and therefore we're experiencing what appears like a unique and egregious tyranny, but it's actually just the tools have emerged rather than a new ideology?
For me, it's the latter. I don't think there's some kind of grand conspiracy. I don't think the heads of all of these places are sitting in a room coming up with, a strategy. No, I think it's much more human story than that. I think that institutions are people, that people are social animals, and that, let's just take the example of Twitter, right? Everyone has been asking me and Matt and others, where are the stories of Twitter shadow banning people on the left? They probably exist, right? But you have to think about who created, at old Twitter at least, who was the institution? The institution was 98 to 99% progressive or Democrats. If Twitter was a social media platform that was located in Western Junction, Colorado, the story would be a totally different story. But it's as if people are surprised that, if you live in San Francisco, if you're working at a place like Twitter with T-shirts that say "Stay woke," if you, your entire world is that world. So should it be surprising that they regard certain kinds of speech as beyond the pale? Should it be surprising that they view what I see as, in some of these cases, just heterodox ideas or just typical conservative ideas as something more like hate speech? It shouldn't surprise us at all. Anyone that's ever been in a very homogenous, whether politically or religiously, environment knows that that's the case.
Yeah, so you think that the ideology is an appendage rather than the essence. Now, I know a lot of people that watch this.
No, I think the ideology is deeply rooted. I'm just saying that I'm not ascribing ill intent to many of these people. I think many of these people genuinely thought, let's just take the case of Trump, and you watch the way they were talking back and forth to each other. And it in many ways reminds me of the times. There were true believers, right? There were true believers who said Trump is basically akin to a terrorist leader or the Christchurch murderer. And those people are driven by ideology. You see people saying, including Yoel Roth, I left academia because I could affect more change in the world from joining Twitter. But then there are other people who are looking out at what was happening in Washington and saying, this is an unprecedented situation. It calls for unprecedented decision making. There's gradations, as there are in any groups. And I think that that's an important aspect of what was happening at Twitter in the period we were reporting on, old Twitter. It's frankly what happened at the New York Times during the very hot summer of 2020, where some people at the New York Times genuinely believed that running an op-ed by a sitting Republican senator literally put their lives in danger. But the vast majority of people who signed on to an idea like that were doing it because of social pressure and because they believed that if they didn't, they would be on the wrong side of history. And I think that dynamic was playing out at old Twitter. It was playing out at the New York Times. It's playing out in book publishing. It's playing out in basically all of the sense-making elite institutions in American life right now. And that is one of the great stories of our time. And the reason it's not being reported on by places like the New York Times or the Washington Post is because they are implicated in it. It's because they are the story.
Yes, you're quite right. And in a sense, those social dynamics and the homogeneity that you're describing, though, it has been arrived at. There is a process that has generated that. And we also are talking about state collusion and intervention and censorship and an astonishing degree of infiltration by, in particular, the FBI. And what I've found more broadly in my conversations with like Adam Curtis or Glenn Greenwald, and now conversations in the House here, is that much of the ideology around civil rights and what has come to be known as identity politics is a convenient way of distracting us from the fact that when it comes to the crunch, Democrat interests ultimately align significantly with establishment interests elsewhere, the military-industrial complex, the financial industry, and big tech. And in order to create a diversion, not because there is a genuine ideological yearning at the heart of the establishment, i.e. its financial heart, but because it is a convenient way of dividing people, these ideas are promoted. And to your point earlier, it used to be accepted and ordinary that we would just sit and chat to people that were conservative or Republican or had really wacky, outlandish conspiratorial views. Or, take, for example, something like as evidently frivolous as Graham Hancock's documentaries about the origin of our species, although in a sense, what could be more important? In a way, the idea that should be censored or dangerous feels like there's a climate of amplification and an appetite for censorship. While the principles appear to be somewhat fluid, i.e. you could find yourself on the wrong side of the argument tomorrow if the wind changes once this precedent has been set and these powers have been granted, it does seem that at the moment there are a set of ideals that are being represented one way or another.
Yeah, but the strain, I get letters from people, maybe you too, you also do, Russell, like every single day, that feel like they were written in the Soviet Union. In other words, it's people saying to me, thank you for saying this out loud. I have a job as a lawyer. I have a job as an accountant. I have a job as a doctor. I agree with you. But if I said those things out loud, I don't know what would happen to me or my career. How did we arrive at that in the West? And I think one of the dynamics of it that is particularly insidious is as you watch, right, as a ordinary person, the list of things grow longer and longer that you have to say or that you don't have to say or that you have to avoid. You're thinking to yourself, what are they going to add tomorrow? What are they going to add next week? What are they going to add 3 months from now? I better just shut up entirely. And I think that the effect of that kind of that self-censorship and self-censorship in anticipation that the list can grow longer is just terrible for our democracy. And it's terrible for our friendships and our relationships. And frankly, I think it leads to political extremism, because when the bounds of what are politically acceptable narrow to such a degree that people with even normal views, like there are differences between men and women, fall outside of it, then they're thinking, well, where can I actually speak the truth? Where can I actually not walk on eggshells? Where can I actually be my full selves? And they will run into the open arms of political extremism. One of the reasons I think it's so important to resist the censorious impulses that I think both of us, for various reasons or from various directions, want to resist is because of that, is because of where this kind of ideology ultimately leads to. And it leads to a place where there's no political center, where people cannot talk to each other, where there's polarization, and where you have half the country thinking the other half are Nazis, depending on which side you're on. That is a recipe for violence and disaster. And it's not a country I want to live in, which is, a lot of the reason why I decided to say bye-bye to the New York Times and to try and start something that lives up to those kind of values, to have honest conversations transparently, out loud, and fearlessly. And I think, frankly, like any journalist who believes in the old school values of journalism needs to be doing the same thing right now.
My personal perspective is one of optimism about humanity, that actually people that are different can get along, and you don't need authoritarianism at the center of all of our institutions, systems, and society in order for people to behave correctly. It's not born of naivety, it's born of true optimism. I also think that what's being masked is the dearth of genuinely new political visions, that we have a heterogeneous political space now where there are no real alternatives, where there are no real voices that are interested in advancing ordinary people's lives, and that we're being invited to bicker and squabble and even kill amongst ourselves and against one another, rather than identify where real power is. To some degree, I think it's just an aesthetic sheen that masks the telos of true power heading in the direction that it always has done. I'm concerned about advancing globalism. I'm concerned about technological dictatorship, advancing surveillance, the ability of the state and private interests to collaborate in exactly the way this story has demonstrated. For me, that we ought to be moving towards a time where there is less centralized power, small amounts of government, and a kind of agreements among ourselves of how we're going to treat one another and the kind of freedoms that we're going to grant one another. My feeling is that most people sort of just want to be left alone. I don't mean in a sort of a narcissistic libertarian way, that people just want to run their own, like people don't want to focus on hatred the whole time. I think we're being stoked into an unnatural state by these kind of movements and this type of agenda. And that's sort of what's fueling it in me, seeing as how you sort of almost asked.
I mean, I agree with you. And I'll tell you just from, having been on the other side of it, in other words, having been the person that commissioned, the 2000th op-ed about how Donald Trump is a unique danger to society, the incentive in it it's unspoken, but it's so obvious, right? It's that, we know from all of these amazing documentary studies and also just our personal experience that outrage keeps us engaged, right? The entire mechanics of these platforms are based on outrage. They're not based on kindness or empathy or love. And I think that one of the great challenges of our time is, how do you use these platforms as the kind of incredible tools that they are? And they are. I mean, I've commissioned amazing pieces because on Twitter, I was able to connect to an underground pastor in Hong Kong. Like, people that I just otherwise wouldn't find have become available to me because of these tools. But, they also can kind of overtake us. And I think that it's, just one of the challenges I find in my own life, forget even as a journalist, just as a civilian, is how do you use what's good about them without becoming subsumed by them? And I think I have found when I'm basically living online, and a lot of my life is online because of my work, you start to sort of see people not as three-dimensional and complicated and, working from good intentions and hearing them in good faith. You sort of start to see people as two-dimensional caricatures. And that's just that's not how I want to live. And that's certainly not a way to do good journalism, because good journalism requires you to put yourself in other people's shoes, to be curious about what motivated them to vote a particular way, and a lot of journalism right now is basically just derivative of Twitter, where Twitter is the ultimate editor. And I think, at least one of my big takeaways, having spent much of the past 2 weeks there, is the necessity to sort of get back on the road, interviewing people in real life and not just looking at kind of the Twitter conversation.
It's extraordinary to me that the culture has become as divisive as it has done. Like, that half of the voting population can be sort of condemned as fascists or terrorists or unacceptable, and that's normalized. When I sort of take deplorable being the defining word. When you take a glimpse at this late night TV culture, I've sort of, because I don't watch too much of it, when I see it, I'm sort of startled by the easy and casual way those narratives are carried. And what it tells me is that there are no viewers in conveying a balanced perspective. So there must be ossification and bifurcation of the culture. They know that there's no one who likes Trump or libertarianism or even perhaps republicanism is watching TV between 10 and 12 at night in the United States. So it does suggest a degree of division that in a way don't seem positive. Barry,
but the thing to be optimistic about is, listen, the companies that we're referring to still have the sort of mechanics of distribution, right? They're able to be beamed into tens of millions of homes across the country. But the thing is, look at where the actual audience is. They're not there. They're with you. They're with Joe Rogan. They're with Taibbi. They're with all of these new things that are part of this like Cambrian explosion of independent media. That is what to be optimistic about. People are voting with their feet. And I think a lot of people still stuck in the old world do not understand that that is over. It's over. You know, audiences are just in a radically different place, and they're seeking voices and journalism that reflects the world as they actually see it, not the world as a few people in Midtown Manhattan wish it were.